Good morning. I'm Claire Blaine, the CEO of Life Sciences Queensland. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge them as being the first scientists and innovators on these lands. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We have over 160 registrations, and I wanted to thank and acknowledge the federal and state members of Parliament who are participating with us today. Before I hand over to the moderator and presenters, I just wanted to give a quick overview of Life Sciences Queensland, or LSQ, for those who may not know too much about us. LSQ is the amplifier of the Queensland Life Sciences ecosystem. We highlight the key role that life sciences innovation plays to feed, fuel, and heal our citizens by building upon our existing strengths and investments. The major focus of LSQ is to bring the best people and the brightest minds together to collectively and collaboratively grasp new opportunities and to help Queensland rise to new world challenges. I encourage you all, if you have not done so already, to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, to download and listen to the Life Sciences in Queensland podcast series, and to join us at upcoming events such as the Future Health series, Advancing Health Through Technology and Innovation seminar on the 24th of March, all of which you can do via our website, lsq.com.au. For some housekeeping, I encourage you to utilise the chat and the Q&A functions at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. These will be answered during the panel discussion towards the end of today's webinar. This webinar will also be recorded. Lastly, and before I do hand over to start today's webinar, I wanted to acknowledge the BioManufacturing Alliance, which consists of QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute, the University of Queensland, Springfield City Group, Lend-Lease, Cytiva, and the Translational Research Institute, and LSQ, as well as all of today's presenters. It is now my pleasure to hand over to our moderator today, Professor Hugh Possingham. Professor Possingham has had a long and distinguished career developing mathematical and economic tools for solving nature conservation problems, such as where to place protected areas and which the most efficient actions for saving threatened species. In his capacity as the Queensland Chief Scientist, he will work to ensure young Queenslanders are inspired to consider a career in science and to encourage community interest in science and advocacy for science. Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you very much, Claire. And it's certainly a pleasure to be here on Monday morning. It's great to see so many people participating, already up around 90 people. And of course, it's a really timely and exciting time to be talking about cell therapies and BioManufacturing Alliance and what's happening in Queensland and around Australia on this topic. And I think it's sort of obvious to everybody in the country that sovereign capability in manufacturing cell therapies, other therapies, vaccines could not be any more important. And we're very, very lucky that we have so much strength in the research and science space in this area, but this isn't just going to be a panel and set of discussions by some scientists. We will have some world-leading scientists in this space, but we're also going to be discussing people who are all about taking the science through all the way the commercialisation process through to manufacturing. And of course, that's the thing that we know routinely Australia doesn't always do. And it's exciting to have the announcement of this BioManufacturing Alliance so that more of the genius and smart research that goes on in our research institutes and also our universities can get through to end products. Basically, we're trying to get to a situation where that research and that innovation is less likely to go overseas and more likely to stay here in Australia. And of course, I'm unfortunately a university scientist who works in ecology, so my understanding of commercialisation and manufacturing is almost nil. So I'm very excited not just to learn about the science of cell therapy and associated science, health science, but also how do you get through that manufacturing process? How do you get the early stage capital? How do you get the centralised research infrastructure that's so essential? And that's why we have such a diverse panel of speakers. Rather than introduce every speaker one by one and break up the flow of the discussion, I'm going to give you an overview of who's to come, like the menu that you're about to expect over the next hour or so. We're going to have 7 speakers, the last one recorded, and then we will have 7 panelists discussing questions from you for about 15 or 20 minutes. If you do have questions, Claire, as Claire said, if you do have questions, just pop them into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll try and address them and synthesise as much as possible and ask them back to the panellists. So our speakers are roughly in this order. Professor Fabienne Mackay. I've had the joy of visiting Fabienne. She is the director and the CEO of the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, Berghofer, several times at their wonderful institute just north of the city. Fabienne has a distinguished career. You know, everybody would love to have their PhD from the Louis Pasteur University in Strasbourg, wouldn't they, I think? And we were very lucky that she moved to Australia, to the Garvan Institute, and then also has taken high-level positions, research and administrative positions at Monash University, Melbourne University. And I don't know how we got you to come to Queensland, but thank you. A stellar researcher with many career accolades. Our second speaker after a few minutes will be Professor Rajiv Khanna. Rajiv also works at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, Berghofer, and he is an expert on immunotherapy and vaccine development. And he's led a lot of successful research programs and novel immunotherapeutic strategies to deal particularly with virus-associated cancers. So this is a person who's working at the cutting edge of science, in applied science, and getting novel therapies out to the world. But then we get to somebody who actually is on the front line of doing all this stuff. It's Professor Dan Chambers. Dan Chambers is the Executive Director of Research at Metro North, which is, I'm told, Australia's largest health service. So it's a daunting prospect being Director of Research at such a huge institution. He's on the front line as a thoracic transplant physician, but also not only is he there on the front line doing that work, surgery, he's also a clinical researcher and has a very strong career in publishing in clinical research. Fourthly, we're going to have, so moving, I suppose, more from the research slowly into the application and the commercialisation. Our next speaker will be Dr. Mathias Kroll, and Mathias is the Chief Commercial Officer for the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, Berghofer. He has a very diverse background and has gone across starting as a scientist all the way through industry and government agencies and research agencies. Great to have somebody from the pharmaceutical industry, and Mathias is going to talk us about the market, which we need to not ignore. The market is everything, and I'm very glad to see that my CSL shares went up last weekend. So I don't know if I can give you any credit for that, Mathias, but clearly we work in a marketplace, and these medical therapeutical shares are very important, and somebody has to pay for everything. Then we have Dr. Aaron Dalgar-Tulloch, and then we have Dr. Leon Scott, who is the General Manager of Scientific Services at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research, Berghofer, and he leads strategy and does a lot of leadership there. Again, a person who has moved across all sectors. I wish more people in my field would move from government to industry to academia, and he's going to talk to us about the manufacturing needs. So we're getting more and more practical here. And our final speaker will be from Canada. Will be a recorded 5-minute talk from Dr. Aaron Dalgar-Tulloch. He is the Global Head of Research and Development, Cell and Gene Therapy Science in Toronto. And they have in Canada a Centre for Commercialisation of Regenerative Medicine. And I suppose if Googling away that on the weekend gives you some idea of where we want to be to, and even better here in Australia in terms of the commercialisation of these brilliant ideas. I find out Janet won't be formally addressing us, but Janet will join our panel. Janet McPherson, Dr. Janet McPherson, she is the Business Development Manager of Cytiva. They work on cell and gene manufacturing solutions, and she's in charge of cell and gene manufacturing solutions across the whole of Asia Pacific. So this brings a strong business perspective. And Jen is another person who's moved across institutions from the private to the public sector to academia. So it's just incredible to have so many people with such diverse backgrounds, and just shows you what has to be brought to bear to these problems. Before I unleash Fabienne upon you, I would be remiss if not mentioning Life Sciences Queensland for organising this. You've heard from Claire. Lockie is organising us and turning us on and off and making sure we don't make the wrong noises at the wrong time and the videos all work. So thanks, Lockie. And somebody who's disappeared to be in the audience is the chair of their board, Christine Williams, and I think has also been instrumental. And as she was warming us up this morning, just really pointing out the importance of being clear about the direction of and the potential of this industry, the research going through to the sovereign manufacturing capabilities, the importance of it now, and actually just crowing a little bit about what we've already achieved, but what we hope to achieve in the future. So thank you, Christine and team Claire, for organising this. Fabienne, tell us a bit about cell therapies.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Hugh, and thank you, Life Science Queensland, for having me this morning. So as you said, Hugh, I came to Queensland 2 years ago, and Queensland has many attributes that attracted me to the state, but certainly a unique strength in cell therapy, in particular at QIMR Berghofer, was really a major attraction for me. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So let me give you a bit of background about cell therapy at QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute. And the work on cell therapies at QIMR Berghofer was successfully pioneered by Professor Rajiv Khanna. And this success in cell therapy led QIMR Berghofer to create QGen. And QGen is a cell therapy manufacturing facility. And after its creation, it benefited from investments from both the Queensland government, but also the Australian Cancer Research Foundation, to upgrade the facility so the facility could manufacture clinical trial grade cell therapies that can be used in the clinic for clinical trials. So actually this step was really instrumental in securing for Queensland, in particular, multi-million-dollar contracts, in particular with a company called Atara Incorporated in the US. And this, with this company, QGen is manufacturing a new type of cell therapy that is designed to treat multiple sclerosis, but a form of multiple sclerosis that is very difficult to treat, which is called progressive multiple sclerosis. So that's a real step for us, and that's been a really important activity at QIMR Berghofer. But what I need to do is really tell you the importance of cell therapies for patients. So many of you may not know what I mean by cell therapies. So what are they? They are human cells usually that are taken from various tissues such as blood, but also other tissues. And they are engineered in the laboratory such that they are performing certain functions that have therapeutic properties. So they are engineered to do something and to be infused back into the patients to treat a particular condition and a disease. And those conditions that can be treated are usually very serious. And these cell therapies actually offer significant advantage to treat conditions such as debilitating conditions, you know, for example, degenerative diseases of the musculoskeletal system, neurodegeneration to cancer. So it's quite a number of diseases that usually are very hard to treat, but cell therapies have really transformed the way we can manage patients with those conditions. So at QIMR Berghofer, we actually manufacture another class of cell therapies, and those have been very effective at treating overwhelming chronic infections. And at the moment, we provide them to different clinical centers in Australia through a particular scheme called the Special Access Scheme. Now, just to tell you the story, 2 years ago, I was only approving maybe one request every 2 months. And this year and last year, I've been approving them every week. So what is that telling us? It's telling us what's the good news for QGen and for us at QIMR Berghofer is our cell therapy products are very highly regarded. So people have heard of them, they know they can offer real benefit in patients, so the demand is going up. So it's great news, but what it's telling us as well is the need in Australia is exponential, it's massive needs of these cell therapies in Australia. So when I saw this, I said, it's really pity. We are missing such a golden opportunity in Queensland and Australia by not developing this activity in a more substantial activity with all capabilities established onshore from hand to hand. Because if we had that, then we'd be changing completely the outcome for patients for generations to come. So I think what would be important here is when I think of this, frankly, you know, it would be absolutely critical to take our destiny into our own hands, because we could really increase the benefits for Australian patients with these new drugs. First, you know, we wouldn't have to wait for global companies headquartered abroad to decide at what point are they going to launch their cell therapies in Australia. And so we could really offer them right away to our patients because we could develop them here in Australia. So, but the problem is here in Australia at the moment, the capacity we have, QGen is fantastic, but it's just not big enough to cater for the projected immense demand for those cell therapies. And so if we don't do anything, then we're going to be dependent on foreign suppliers. And I'm going to talk about that because this has a cost. When you require those cell therapies from overseas, the price is prohibitive and it's not sustainable for the health budget in Australia. So as I said, we are experiencing a growing demand for those cell therapies, and there's a good reason because they offer such great benefit in the clinic. But at the moment, I will give you an example. If you have an Australian patient who's eligible to receive a licensed cell therapy named Yescarta, and Yescarta cell therapies, they're made overseas. I mean, it's you know, not made in Australia. They are made to treat leukemia. And so when a patient is eligible in Australia, the patient gives blood. That blood is shipped to the United States. Then it's processed and engineered, and then it's shipped back to Australia to be infused in the patients. Now you can just imagine the logistic of that is really not practical. Not only that, because of that logistic, the price is astronomical, you know, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm pretty sure Yescarta is around about $450,000 per patient. And I'm not even mentioning the supply chain disruptions when you have COVID. So it means that huge issues about relying on foreign sources for those kind of therapies. And the thing that's really why I'm so passionate about this, because in Queensland, we have the know-how, we have the capacity to have this industry here in Australia. Not only that, we are developing our homegrown cell therapy products. So, and then if we had that, we wouldn't have our innovators having to license too early our homegrown cells to foreign industries. And so if we could manufacture them in Australia, the revenue back to Australia would be, you know, by a different order of magnitude. So we are losing on revenue because our scientists, they don't have the manufacturer here, so they have to license early elsewhere, and usually overseas. So the BioManufacturing Alliance, if that goes ahead and we can manufacture here, it would really make those cells immediately accessible to Australians, more affordable, decrease wait time, security of supply, and greater equity for patients, to be honest. And not only that, Australia would have a unique range of products that you couldn't find elsewhere. And we could create thousands of jobs, highly skilled jobs, and many more of direct and indirect jobs. So that's it for me. I think if there is a sector in the biomedical industry that could really transform the economy of Australia, cell therapy industry is one of them. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Fabienne. That was a wonderful introduction. And of course, you know, from somebody from my naive position, it's incredible to see how something that I just thought was all about bone marrow transplants 20 years ago has just come so far, and the diversity of applications of the new work. So it's now exciting to introduce your colleague, who you've described as a pioneer. So that's frightening. Professor Khanna, tell us a little bit about your research into living drugs.
To unmute myself. Thank you, Hugh. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to join this special panel. So today I'm going to share you some of our experience and our sort of many years of developing these cell therapies, which I label as living drugs, and the way we are changing the whole way we treat cancer, infectious diseases, and how we're going to develop these sort of treatment for patients. Just going to make sure. Hope my slides are visible from the other side. People can see those. So these are my disclosures. Particularly, I want to mention my association with Atara Biotherapeutics, which Fabienne briefly mentioned. We are conducting advanced manufacturing for that company here in Brisbane and QIMR for cell therapies. I'll go through that a little bit of that program. So what is living drugs, or what are cell therapies? The terms living drugs were actually coined by Bruce Levine, who at UPenn, and it's a fantastic word. You know, while we treat patients with chemical drugs, when we have cells which are actually grown in the test tube and then injected back into the patient, and they can modify the disease process, that's called living drugs. And that's what has happened over the last decade or so. This field has exploded like anything. And you can see at the bottom right corner, the cell therapy market is expected to reach well over $48 billion. With a compound annual growth rate of 25% plus. So you can see this growing revolution going on there in the cell therapies. And one of the biggest, as Fabienne mentioned, is the CAR-T therapy, where these are immune cells taken from the patient, genetically modified, and then injected back into the patient. And these cells are primarily targeted to kill the cancer cells. And literally like 10 years ago, nobody talked about this. And then suddenly the whole field just exploded, and we saw this acquisition of Kite Pharma by Gilead for $12 billion, and also the Juno Therapeutics by Celgene. And since then, there have been now hundreds of clinical trials currently ongoing in phase 1 or phase 2, and Mathias is going to briefly talk about that in subsequent slides. And these are the 5 CAR-T therapies which FDA has approved in the last few years. And the SCADA was mentioned by Fabienne. QIMR is already currently being manufactured in Melbourne and the cell therapies. And these are actually revolutionizing the way we treat hematological malignancies. We still have huge challenges, particularly when these drug products are manufactured, particularly from patients who are critically ill. And there are new platform technologies that are coming on board. And I'll briefly discuss that in this. And the excitement is not just only in the pharma industry, but I found this very interesting advertisement by a car company, Toyota, and which actually highlighted how valuable suddenly this whole field has become. I'll share this with you now.
Cells protect us on the inside. Now there's a cell that helps protect us on the outside. It's the result of GO, a safety program that exceeds world-class standards. The Toyota Safety Cell.
Hope you can understand the excitement that is in the industry as well. So over the last 20 years, we have been one of the very unique groups in Australia who have taken cell therapies from bench to bedside to business. And I'll share you those part of the stories. And we have multiple clinical programs, and we have run phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials. Some of these cell therapies are going through clinical trials in the brain cancer, head and neck cancers. We also have collaborations with clinical centers in Australia on infectious complication in transplant patients, multiple sclerosis, HPV, many sort of complications. And all of these cell therapies are locally manufactured and shipped around the country, in fact, overseas as well. One of the best things what we have is, as Fabienne mentioned, is one of the largest cell therapy manufacturing facility, which is co-located within the QIMR campus. This is QGen Cell Therapeutics, and is headed by a fantastic team led by Darren Liang, Brett Butcher, and Tracy Watson, who have done a fantastic job in helping us in translating our basic research to clinical outcomes. And above them is also very important to acknowledge is that people who do the actual manufacturing. These are some of our team members. I call them blue crews, who actually go into the QGen and do the cell therapy manufacturing. They've been working on this for well over a decade and have helped us to translate many of those products into clinic. We have developed GMP compliant processes, both for autologous. In autologous, I mean when we take the immune cells from the patient, we bring into the laboratory in our manufacturing facility, and we can then retrain the immune cells. And then these are then prepared as injection vials and shipped back into the clinic for treatment of the patient. More recently, there is a growing interest in this field called allogeneic. In this setting, what happens, because the patient might be quite sick, may not have the appropriate immune cells, there is interest now taking the immune cells from healthy donors like you and I, and then training these immune cells again in our GMP facility, storing these cells in a bank, and then tissue matching those cells with the patients and shipping them within 24 to 48 hours. That's a huge difference between the autologous and allogeneic. The autologous product can take up to anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks to manufacture, whereas the allogeneic product can be offered within 24 to 48 hours. So one of the very first, it's sort of a story you can say started almost 20 years ago, and that was our collaboration with our colleagues at the Prince Charles Hospital, Scott Bell, I'm sure he's joined this meeting as well, and Keith McNeil, Andrew Galbraith, who had a patient actually at the Prince Charles Hospital who had a bilateral lung transplant, who developed EBV lymphomas, as shown in the white arrows on this slide. And they reached out to us when I was used to work as a postdoc in Dennis's group, and asked if we could do something about this patient. And just so happened we were able to grow, for the first time in the world, EBV-specific T cells from this patient and infuse it back. And within sort of 2 weeks, patient started showing clinical responses, and at the end showed a complete resolution of this lymphoma. This was a very important start for us because it was, you can call it the first breakthrough, because it sets it up for many, many years of future development of cell therapies. And we have done many clinical trials and published a lot of reports. But those are more important. Above that is what we learned from the patients and what patients experience. I'd like to share you the story of one of the patients we treated at, and who was at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. It was a courtesy of ABC News. Sorry, just going back.
It was a long shot that paid off. When a patient in Brisbane developed a life-threatening infection after a transplant, doctors decided to try an experimental procedure. Amazingly, the patient made a full recovery. Medical reporter Sophie Scott explains.
Brendan Parks is a lucky man. During cancer treatment, he needed a bone marrow transplant. He developed a serious infection that his immune system was unable to fight off.
It just wasn't getting better, and I was getting sicker.
With nothing to lose, doctors at the Queensland Institute for Medical Research took a radical approach. Some of the patient's T cells, the body's defence system, were removed. The cells were exposed to the virus which was killing the patient, and that created lots of healthy new T cells which were injected back into the patient.
These sort of breakthroughs happen once in a decade. So I've been in this field for well over 20 years.
Here you can see the damaged lining of the patient's bowel and the virus present in the cells. After the treatment, it's all clear.
Like after the first couple of treatments, we noticed a big improvement. So, they didn't need to say, it's all good. I mean, we knew.
It was dramatic, the effect, and really quite rapid in a period of 1 to 2 months that it actually seemed to work. So it was very surprising. Yeah.
While it's only been tried on one patient, doctors believe the findings have important implications for transplant recipients around the world.
I'm ecstatic. How happy can you be? I've still got other issues, but they're not going to kill me.
Since the treatment, Brendan Parks has made a full recovery. Sophie Scott, ABC News.
So you could see the impact on an individual patient that can have these cell therapies. So we've actually sort of moved on and done a lot of other clinical studies that I showed in the publication, but we currently have 2 clinical trials going on, one in the pediatric population, another in adult. In those 2 trials, we are now using off-the-shelf allogeneic T-cell therapies. We are now collaborating with the Australian Bone Marrow Donor Registry, and those donor registry are providing us healthy donors where we manufacture the T-cells, and these cells are then stored down in the bank, and then we tissue match with this patient for these 2 clinical trials. And in addition, actually, we are, as Fabienne mentioned, a major provider of T-cell therapy for critically ill patients under the TGA Special Access Scheme. And one of the examples is shown here. We had a young kid who was admitted to the Queensland Children's Hospital, who actually, after this stem cell transplant, developed a very serious complication in his eye, which is called CMV retinitis. It's a viral infection which can damage the vision of the eye. So we actually were reached out by the hospital staff, and we prepared the cell therapy for this kid. And you can see by the time patient received the 6th infusion, he had completely cleared the infection and became absolutely normal, and his vision was completely restored. And since, we have for last almost well over, as Fabienne said, with the demand has been growing exponentially. We have all these hospitals in Victoria, New South Wales, of course in Queensland and Western Australia. But we've also starting to get requests now, as you can see here, New Zealand and Hong Kong. Actually, in fact, yesterday, I got a request from Germany. So they've been asking us if we can ship some cells to them as well. So we're becoming probably one of the unique centers in the world to be able to offer these type of therapies to patients right around the world. The other thing which we have also done is taken from the transplant setting our knowledge and expanded it to treat solid cancers. Here's an example of a patient who actually had a cancer protruding on his neck, and we gave him the T-cell therapy and then combined with the chemotherapy and showed a complete resolution of that cancer. And we've also expanded these same cell therapies to brain cancer as well. And again, you can just see we have seen this remarkable long-term survival of some of these patients. We are still trying to understand how that happens, because we still have to go through what we call phase 2 and beyond randomized studies, but the early signs are quite encouraging. And again, I want to share one of the story of one of the patient who was enrolled in the brain cancer patient who survived for almost 8 to 10 years.
After the Voice on 9.
Brisbane researchers are celebrating a medical breakthrough which offers new hope to those with incurable brain cancer. Scientists have found a way to use the body's own immune system to fight the disease and, in many cases, more than double a patient's life expectancy.
Around 800 Australians are diagnosed with glioblastoma, our most common malignant brain cancer, every year. Most don't survive more than 6 months.
This cancer, only 3% patient will survive in 5 years' time.
Now, a world-first breakthrough is not only buying patients hope, it's buying them precious time.
Daniel just came up and said to me, "Nan, you've got to fight it, and we're going to give you a great-grandchild." And with Daniel. So, yeah, you had to fight it.
Helen Easton was diagnosed with the aggressive tumour 3 years ago. Thanks to Professor Rajiv Khanna and his team, she's been able to welcome little Hallie into the world. The results from their 4-year immunotherapy trial are astounding.
And we have a number of patients who are alive and are disease-free well over multiple years.
The breakthrough is linked to a common, relatively harmless virus known as CMV. About 50% of the adult population has it. But what scientists discovered is that about half of all glioblastoma tumours also contain the virus. QIMR Berghofer scientists then developed a way to remove and train the body's own immune cells to fight the virus, and once reintroduced to the body, kill it and the cancer.
Basically like taking a lay person and training that person to become an army person.
Unlike traditional cancer treatments such as chemo and radiotherapy, immunotherapy has virtually no side effects, making it an incredibly safe and effective treatment option.
It hasn't badly affected patients' quality of life, and I think that's the exciting thing about this particular research.
Phase 2 of the trial will be conducted here and internationally in the hope of having the treatment more widely available within a decade. Kath Landers, 9 News.
So you can see that this is really satisfying. As a scientist, you get this experience seeing the patients, our cell therapies benefiting some of these patients, and how it happens, that translation. We talk about all the publications, research, grants, but when it comes out with the patient outcome, you see how much of satisfaction you get out of these. And we've been doing this trying to get that these therapies to the patient as fast as possible. The other new area that we have now gone is to take these cell therapies beyond transplantation and cancer. And one of the areas that Fabienne briefly mentioned is the multiple sclerosis. And that is a program that started a few years ago in collaboration with Professor Michael Pender at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. MS remains one of the highly unmet need there is for this treatment of these patients. There are around 2.8 million patients diagnosed and living with MS worldwide. And of those, 1.2 million patients have had a progressive form of the disease. And what is interesting over the last few years, there is a growing evidence that there is a virus actually is playing a very important role in the pathogenesis of the disease, and that's Epstein-Barr virus. In fact, just last week only, there was a breakthrough paper was published in a top science journals where they actually showed that if you have EBV infection and then you develop acute EBV infection and there's a 32-fold increased risk of developing MS post EBV infection. And they showed that actually very nicely that the EBV response, that the antibody responses to EBV can damage the sheath of the neurons in our body, and that can cause the multiple sclerosis. And that actually drove us our interest in asking the question, could you actually develop an immunotherapy or a cell-based immunotherapy that could specifically target EBV in these MS patients? And that was the trial we did with collaboration with Professor Michael Pender. And this was a study published a few years ago. And we showed actually, it is an example of one of the patients. You can see that in the pre-therapy scan, the gadolinium enhancing lesions shown by the white arrows, and post-therapy, those lesions have disappeared. And these patients actually do quite well. And in some of the cases, when you give T-cell infusion shown by the black arrows on the left case, and the number of lesions showing going down in this patient quite dramatically. And also there's another biomarker, there's an antibody in the intrathecal, which also goes down as well. Taking the clue from these early studies, we actually signed a licensing agreement with Atara Biotherapeutics almost 4.5 years ago, and then led to development of this next stage of the MS immunotherapy, which we call ATA188. And this actually agreement has brought in almost $80+ million of licensing fee, R&D, milestone royalties, and above all, the manufacturing contract. And plus, we have created 40 or 50 new jobs in Queensland in the area of cell therapies, which was previously not there. And this is what the advantage is when you have a strong collaboration with the pharma industry and you have breakthrough products. And we have actually worked with Atara and developed a very robust manufacturing process for the off-the-shelf ATA188. And actually all the manufacturing for this drug product is currently being done at QIMR in the QGen facility. And what we do is we take the blood lymphocytes of healthy donors, and these cells are then stimulated in the test tube, and then we grow multiple vials of each of the therapy and stored in as a bank. And these cells are then matched with the patient. We have treated patients not just in Australia, but also in the US under this trial. And the phase 1 trial conducted by Atara, they've just released very recently the results from this, and they had this trial which has included 4 different cohorts, increasing the dose of the T-cell therapy, starting from 5 million going up to 40 million. And then some of these patients also continued what we call open label extension. And what was remarkable, we found that actually not only there was some clinical improvement in these patients, number of patients showed reversing of the disease. That is, their extended disability score improved. This has never happened before. The current treatment only delayed the progression. This therapy is for the first time is showing reversing of the disease, which is, in my expectation, was beyond explanation. And that's what I think it'd be interesting that when we actually take it to the advanced stage clinical trial, which is currently ongoing with the phase 2 studies, can we actually prove it and show its efficacy in larger cohort of patients? This is a very important breakthrough for MS patients. And it is estimated if you are successful, it has a multi-billion-dollar potential for this transformative therapy. According to Atara, it's probably a potential annual revenue of $3.5 billion. You can imagine the product like that could become a blockbuster in the future. Just to concluding my talk, I really want to acknowledge the support for our clinical studies and also for QGen, particularly from Therapeutic Innovation Australia. They have provided fantastic funding for our T-cell therapy manufacturing, but also to the QGen facility, and Queensland government for upgrading our QGen facility, Australian Cancer Research Foundation, and of course, MS Queensland and MS Australia, who were really provided us funding, critical funding for clinical trial. And I just also want to mention NHMRC, because it was the original NHMRC funding which allowed us to establish QGen facility many years ago. Just to conclude, but also thank to my many colleagues. You will hear Dan Chambers, with whom we have collaborated for many years, and other colleagues at different hospitals, the Royal Adelaide Hospital, Royal Brisbane Hospital, and of course our colleagues at the Atara Biotherapeutics. And I also acknowledge the business development team at QIMR who have helped us to progress this program with the industry partners.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. That's really quite amazing work, and it must be very fulfilling to have those successes. It's also just nice to see television news that is positive. Wouldn't it be nice if all of the television news, whatever channel you're watching, was like that all the time? I love the phrase "from bench to bedside to business," and that's a great segue too to your colleague, Professor Dan Chambers. Dan is there right at the front line. I don't know how he finds time to give a webinar like this. Our webinar is all about medicines of the future, making them here. And Dan is on the front line as a clinician, as a researcher and an administrator. Dan, love to hear what you've got to say.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Sorry, just a bit of a technical issue finding my slides. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, yes.
I might just have to close for a second. I can't find my share screen.
And while we're waiting for Dan, obviously we're going to be talking about commercialisation and government involvement, research institutes and infrastructure. We shouldn't also forget the enormous role of philanthropy, Chuck Feeney, Clive Berghofer, because that philanthropy, I think, has enabled a lot of this research to progress at a very base level, at that base infrastructure level. How are you going, Dan? Should be some green button there.
Sorry, I'm back, Hugh, so I'll try again there now.
Great.
Hopefully you've got that there now.
We're not in slideshow view. We can see the separate slides. Great, perfect.
There. Sorry about that. So look, it's my great pleasure, and thanks very much, Hugh and LSQ, for organising this event. And it's been my great pleasure actually to work with Rajiv for probably almost a decade, isn't it, Rajiv? So I'm also going to share a couple of patient perspectives, and just very briefly a patient I'm sure Rajiv will remember. But then if you weren't already convinced that Southeast Queensland is an epicentre for the development of these cell therapies, I'm going to change tack a little bit to talk about transplant tolerance and how we've been tackling that with cell therapies. So I'm just going to share with you, first of all, Matthew's story briefly. So Matthew had cystic fibrosis and underwent a heart, lung, liver transplant in Brisbane quite a few years ago. Initially a difficult course, but then he turned up to clinic at 3 months post-transplant with this chest X-ray here. And for the uninitiated, this is the left lung, this is the right lung. And these big cannonball lesions shouldn't be here. So he developed what looked like metastatic tumour, unfortunately, at 3 months. We biopsied this tumour, and this was an Epstein-Barr virus-driven tumour called post-transplant lymphoma. Matthew underwent standard chemotherapy, but really failed that therapy and wasn't able to tolerate it, and his prognosis was very poor. It was at that point that I turned to Rajiv, as we'd been developing the autologous treatment, and I turned to Rajiv to see whether we could trial allogeneic treatment for Matthew. He underwent allogeneic adoptive EBV-targeted T-cell therapy, and incredibly, a few months later, this is what his chest X-ray looked like. So another, incredible clinical win. But what I'm really going to talk about now is transplant tolerance. So transplantation is a life-saving procedure, obviously, for many patients all over the world, and unfortunately is still restricted, largely, of course, through donor organ shortage. But once a patient undergoes transplantation, the big barrier across all organs is loss of tolerance, which is manifested as chronic rejection of the organs. And this is certainly true for lung transplantation. So this is our data from our international society. This is the proportion of patients who develop chronic rejection in the first 5 years after transplantation. So you can see that's 50% of patients have chronic rejection by the time they reach 5 years post-transplant. I'm now going to introduce you to a gentleman who is no stranger to rejection, and this is Damien's story. So Damien initially underwent bone marrow transplantation quite a few years ago. Did well initially, but then developed a very common complication, which is akin to rejection following solid organ transplant. It's called graft versus host disease. That particularly attacked Damien's lungs, and he developed very severe lung disease and respiratory failure. And I first met him when he was referred to us for consideration of lung transplantation, given this background of bone marrow transplantation. And he was in respiratory failure when I first met him. He underwent bilateral lung transplantation at Prince Charles Hospital and initially did very well, but unfortunately, as you've seen from that slide, his risk of developing chronic rejection was high. So he did well initially, but then subsequently in the next few years developed some chronic rejection of his new lungs. And the issue really is that there's a huge clinical need here because there is no effective treatment thus far for chronic rejection. Let's just hear from Damien briefly.
My name is Damien Thompson. I'm a bone marrow transplant and double lung transplant recipient. As a patient that suffers from rejection, I was excited to hear about the CLAD Assist study. It is an amazing opportunity for patients like me to participate in, and having done so, I felt no side effects, and today I'm feeling a lot better. So thank you to all those who made this possible.
So Damien's taken part in a phase 2 study, which is almost complete. And you'll see that from this pipeline of work, much like Rajiv's, is actually very advanced. When you hear presentations like this, usually companies, institutions are talking about preclinical work or very early phase 1. But as you'll see, we've managed to bridge the bench to bedside gap here. So Damien has taken part in a clinical trial of mesenchymal stromal cells, which are a potently immunosuppressive cell type, which we believe will be of assistance in inducing tolerance and long-term survival after organ transplantation. Most times these cells are derived from bone marrow. The lung is a particularly attractive target for these cells because when they're given intravenously, they pass through the right side of the heart, through the pulmonary arteries, and actually lodge in the target organ very simply. There's some information about what the mechanism of action is once they arrive in the lung, but as you'll see from the study that I'll tell you about, we're going to get a lot more insight into how that happens and be able to improve potentially therapeutic products. So we embarked on this endeavour many years ago, and you can see that from the photograph here. So this is one of the first patients who took part in our phase 1 study. As you saw from Rajiv, these studies have been funded by quite small grants initially, this one from the Prince Charles Hospital Foundation. So we conduct a N=10 phase 1 study all the way back in about 2015. And we demonstrated that not only was this feasible and safe to take this approach in patients who had quite severe chronic rejection, but you also managed to dramatically reduce their rate of decline. So this is the infusion, this is their rate of decline before, and you can see a really strong levelling out here. And this gentleman here achieved about 10 years, achieved almost 10 years of extra survival after he first took part in the study. So that's what we did there. So what we wanted to do is move this therapy to phase 2 and get closer to the beginning of transplantation here. So we then were awarded NHMRC funding for a phase 2 study, really targeted at new onset of chronic rejection, so we could find these patients early and treat them early, hopefully prevent their progression. So that's the study that Damien has taken part in. So this study is led from Brisbane. I'm the principal investigator. It's an Australian-wide study. It's the Australian study of stem cell therapy to induce sustained tolerance in transplant patients with chronic lung allograft dysfunction, chronic rejection, the ASSIST-CLAD study. We have a really eminent data safety monitoring board, international, overseeing this study. And our target is to recruit 82 patients. We're actually almost on track to complete that by July of this year. Patients are randomised 1-to-1 to receive intravenous MSCs or placebo. And this will be one of the world's largest ever studies of a cell therapy for any lung disease. Very importantly, we have an amazing companion data set from our clinical materials, including blood, but also bronchoscopy, obtained lung fluid and cells pre and post infusion, which will be by far the most informative to not only inform our study, but also the mechanism of action of these cells across all indications. So a really amazing opportunity to refine our product and improve things for the future. What about a post-assist clad? So if we hit our primary endpoint with this study, remember this is preclinical phase 1 and phase 2, we've already gone through with this study. You'll see companies going to market with simply preclinical data attracting a couple of $100 million worth of capitalization. It's likely we'd go through the FDA fast track breakthrough pathway with annual sales in lung transplant estimated at $250 million. The total MSC market size is estimated to be $6 billion by 2028. But what we're constrained with at the moment is market scale up. If we miss our primary endpoint, but we hit our secondaries, there'll be some further work to do in phase 2 and phase 3 studies, which will be informed by the data we obtain, the ancillary data we obtain to improve potency. Again, marked scale up in manufacturing is required. Even if we miss our endpoints, the ancillary data we get will very likely inform the selection of new therapeutics into the future. The way this industry is evolving is that there's becoming a change from cell therapies to really what are effectively manufactured cells, and we've seen that with the RNA vaccine technology. So just as by way of an example, we're working with a company out of Stanford called Rejuvenation Technologies, which have developed a technology based on the RNA vaccine technology with a lipid nanoparticle laden with mRNA, which targets an enzyme which leads to lung fibrosis, and they've targeted the lipid nanoparticle to be trophic for the lung. So that company is wanting to move into phase 1 studies by next year, and it would be wonderful if we had the capability to manufacture their product locally in Queensland and develop it here in Queensland. So you can see from the information I've showed you that we're certainly an epicenter of cell therapies in southeast Queensland, currently really constrained by scale and ability to commercialise. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Dan, and that's another great segue. Firstly, to the importance of the market and manufacturing. Also reminds us about the importance of your role as a clinical researcher. Interesting to note, in a couple of talks we've said we don't fully understand the mechanism, so all the details of the science are still yet to be unravelled, but we're doing it, it's happening, and it's going to market. And also we should all be reminded that this is another great example of the very wide application of cell therapies to so many sorts of disease. So our next speaker, we're now moving on this pathway from bench to bedside, now more into business. We have Dr. Mathias Kroll. He is the Chief Commercial Officer of Queensland Institute of Medical Research at Berghofer, and he's going to talk to us a bit more about the market.
Thank you very much, Hugh. It is my pleasure to provide you with some basics of the magnitude and dynamics of the cell therapy development and manufacturing markets, which I find very inspiring from a commercial perspective. A key market segment for a full service cell therapy manufacturer is the clinical trials market, where partnerships are formed between innovators and manufacturers in order to develop technical manufacturing processes, upscaling, and manufacturing of products for certain types of preclinical and especially for clinical trials. Behind these numbers, there are lots of different uses. Cell therapies are developed against cancer, infectious disease, inflammatory disease, autoimmune disease, and regenerative uses. When we look at the industry pipeline according to the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, we see now over 2,000 active clinical trials, not counting the ones that have been completed. As you would expect in a market which is in a strong growth phase, you see a relative abundance of mid-stage phase 2 clinical trials, which run much longer than the early stage phase 1 trials.
Mathias, we're not actually seeing your slideshow. We're just seeing your slides.
Apologize for that. Let me try that again. Can you see this?
Perfect.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Apologies for that. So there are still relatively few pivotal phase 3 trials yet, and this is the result of the first large wave of product approvals still coming through to this stage, rather than being a result of high attrition and technology failure. Now, the volume and value of development and manufacturing work increases significantly between early and late clinical development. In general, manufacturers try to have the commercial manufacturing process locked in by the time they start phase 3. Industry and academia are both important sponsors, and the high proportion of academic and government sponsors at this stage can be seen as a sign of high level of innovation. Notably, pharma companies developing cell therapies plan to outsource about half of their manufacturing activity, reflecting the need to address high need for scarce capacity and capability. A decade ago, activity was still moderate, but now there are nearly 1,000 products in development, and this number is expected to triple in just 4 years from now. Compared to other modalities, technology failure rates along the development journey have been comparatively lower, even if only a bit, than for other modalities such as proteins and nucleic acid technologies. As tech transfers tend to increase the risk of failure, becoming a trusted and preferred partner for an innovator offers the unique opportunity to capture high-value business as you accompany the innovator throughout the whole journey to market. Never change a winning team. The expanding clinical pipeline translates into fast growth of the overall global cell therapy market. And the projection you see here from Coherent Market Insights and some other sources projects up to $100 billion worth of market by 2030. That is not inconsistent with other sources, which you've seen on Rajiv's slide, which project 45 billion by 2027. Key growth drivers here are new product approvals, expanding target population, improved access, reimbursement, payment models, and maturing clinical delivery. There are also first indications of excellent persistence of certain types of cell therapies and long-term activity. Investment into the space is rapidly increasing and reached $23 billion in 2021, reflecting a growth rate of 135% over a period of 2 years to fund the development of new assets. And CAR-T companies, which Rajiv mentioned, alone received $3.5 billion in funding in just 2 years. Now, several market research reports predict aggressive 5-year compound annual growth rates exceeding 35%, but even if it's 25%, whatever the real number is going to be, the growth is nearly explosive. The US market shows the highest growth and diversity and likely also profitability, as customers there traditionally have limited power to negotiate on price. That may not be the case in other regions. However, Asia Pacific already being a stronghold in innovating regenerative medicine cell therapies, we will see a lot of volume growth, as also the launch sequence of global companies is going to reach Asia Pacific in the late 2020s. So there will be a more balanced mix of cell therapy types in Asia Pacific and a halo effect of some global T-cell focused therapies that are being developed overseas first. So this rapid growth has indeed created a critical global shortage of manufacturing capacity and capabilities that can produce cell therapies suitable for human use. And that means there is currently a window of opportunity to build here and to establish these capabilities regionally. So the industry globally is rushing to build and buy cell therapy manufacturing capacity. BioNTech is known to most of us as the inventor of the Pfizer COVID vaccine. But while everybody was worrying about, what is the next generation vaccine and when and how do we administer our boosters, part of BioNTech actually prepared the next phase of growth last year by acquiring from Kite a facility for cell therapies, as this is a rapidly growing part of their portfolio. Meanwhile, Fujifilm acquired a facility for cell therapies called Atom from our licensee Atara. And there are many, many other examples going also to very high value merger and acquisition deals. Meanwhile, industry, academia, and government often enter into public-private partnerships in different countries to provide capabilities and capacity for innovation in advanced therapeutic modalities, including cell therapies and often focusing on cell therapies. And we will hear about one of those in one of the following talks. Examples of these include also Landmark Bio in Massachusetts and the Cell Therapy Catapult organization in the UK. We also observe increasing competition between countries to establish cell therapy manufacturing hubs. Singapore and Malaysia are one of the countries that can be named as being at the forefront of attracting successfully manufacturing capacity in order to become a hub and a bridge between West and East for these cell therapies. But globally, there is an excellent opportunity to establish a strong regional center in Asia Pacific right now, as long as we don't miss this opportunity. And what this opportunity exactly is will be described by my colleague, Leon Scott. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathias. And I hope that my uni super fund managers were listening to your talk. Mathias has talked to us about the market and where it's going, and I suppose just a booming market in this space and the drive for manufacturing. So it's a very good segue also to his colleague at QIMR, Leon Scott, who's the General Manager for Scientific Services, and is going to talk about the manufacturing track record we have now, but also what we need to go into the future to get this sovereign capability. Leon.
Thanks, Hugh. Can my slide deck, is that showing properly?
Perfect.
Excellent, we've got a winner. Okay, so thanks, Hugh, and thank you everybody for being online. Really what I wanted to do today was spend a few minutes, I guess, overviewing the manufacturing requirements to commercialise cell therapies, and then explore what we need to do in Australia to be able to manufacture those therapies here. But first, I do need to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the first people and traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, live, learn and work. And I also wish to acknowledge that QIMR Berghofer is located on the traditional lands of the Turrbal people and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So the main question I want to explore is, what do we need to do in Australia? We've seen some examples today of some amazing innovative therapies. And the question is, how do we take those therapies and transform them into something that is a medicine that's widely available to patients? So on that front, let's do a quick review or a bit of an insight into how we actually manufacture new medicines. How do we take that innovation and turn it into a medicine? So the process starts in the research laboratory where the therapy is discovered. This stage includes laboratory validation and preclinical studies, and it's usually at a small scale and what we might call research grade. That's not a criticism of what's done, but it generally has less quality control than is required later and doesn't conform to the regulatory requirements for a medicinal product. So the next step, when we've got that well-tested, established innovation, we need to transform those research methods into pilot scale manufacturing processes. This involves a very large amount of work to optimize the process, to characterize the product, and also develop increasing conformance to the regulatory requirements. We then move across to the third stage, and that's where we scale up the manufacturing for late stage clinical trials. This involves increasing automation and large scale of equipment. With the third image, there's an example of some of those automation options that we'll be looking at. Substantial effort is made at this stage to increase the manufacturing controls and really locking those down and ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements, not just in Australia, but across multiple countries. And the final stage of this pipeline is the commercial manufacturing of approved medicines. This requires at-scale production and an example of an at-scale facility is shown on the right. This needs to conform with global regulatory standards and also all the commercial requirements that the clients will need. So if that's the pipeline, how does Australia rate for cell therapies? So in the discovery stage, I mean, we've seen it today, Australian researchers are exceptional. They perform well above our weight in terms of population size and the investment we make. And as we saw at this stage, QIMR Berghofer has an enviable track record, and Rajiv and others have gone into those details today. At the pilot stage, Australia has a small number of facilities and providers, but they do an excellent job and have excellent capabilities. I am a little bit biased because QGen Cell Therapeutics is one of those providers. And as Rajiv has alluded to, with the expertise in QIMR Berghofer, we've been manufacturing these therapies in QGen for about 20 years. The challenge at this stage for Australia is that our national capacity is very limited and the demands are very big. And basically that means it's causing substantial delays for Australian researchers and business to get a spot in those facilities. And this means that many of our innovators go offshore rather than waiting to get access to those facilities in Australia. If we move on to the scale-up stage, it gets even more challenging. Australia has very limited capacity. And what that very small capacity means is we have an effective access block. Researchers and businesses with cell therapies are mostly forced to go offshore at that stage because they can't access the facilities they need. And finally, at the commercial stage, our capacity to manufacture commercial cell therapies in Australia is extremely small. And this is really summarised in the graph at the bottom. And you can see in that graph the impact of that reducing capacity on the retained value. While many of our discoveries might enter pilot stage manufacture in Australia, very, very few will actually get through the entire pipeline to be manufactured here as a commercial product. And effectively, that lack of domestic capabilities creates a barrier which forces Australian innovation, Australian researchers and Australian businesses offshore, simply because they cannot continue to have their product developed here. And this is a huge loss for Australia because most of the good stuff about these therapies is on the other side of that barrier. Most of the retained value, the creation of a large number of high-paid jobs, the economic benefits to the Australian community, and most importantly, the positive patient outcomes to the large patient populations all sit on the other side of that barrier. So what can we do about it? And really, that's where the BioManufacturing Alliance comes in and why it was created. We're establishing the cell therapy component of that alliance to leverage the experience and expertise developed at QIMR Berghofer and QGen Cell Therapeutics to create a new capacity to support the entire development and commercialization pipeline, from pilot manufacture through to scale up and ultimately commercial manufacturing in Australia. So what does commercial cell therapy look like in the BioManufacturing Alliance? Within the Alliance, we will establish a new large-scale cell therapy manufacturing facility. This will be focused on accelerating the development and commercialization of cell therapies across, accelerating the development and commercialization of cell therapies discovered by Australian researchers, as well as retaining Australian companies here. It will also attract international companies to come to Australia for their development and manufacturing activities. And this is not a new idea, it's something we've already started. QGen Cell Therapeutics already supports the development of many Australian therapies, and at the moment has attracted 5 international biotechnology companies to undertake manufacturing and clinical trials in Australia. That's the reality now. The new facility will allow us to expand and fast-track this work. It will be a highly flexible factory for the development and manufacture of cell therapies. It's ideally located on the Hurston Health Precinct. We have close access to the essential clinical expertise that Dan's represented today. The deep research experience that Rajiv has introduced and is close to national and international transport links. So that's a little bit of an introduction to the cell therapy activities, but the BioManufacturing Alliance is doing much more in the ecosystem. We will also be creating similar capabilities for the development and manufacture of biologics, therapeutic proteins and vaccines, and they will be subject to a future seminar, so keep an eye out for the invitation from Life Sciences Queensland. The BMA is something that it's a really special alliance, and it really takes advantage of the high levels of collaboration that already exist between researchers, industry and government in Queensland, and will create 3 interlinked precincts. And these precincts that will ensure that when it comes to the medicines of the future, we really can manufacture them here. So on that positive note, I'm going to hand you back to Hugh to introduce our last speaker.
Thanks a lot, Lee, and what a great outline of the BioManufacturing Alliance and the enormous opportunities we have before us in this space. So our last speaker is a remote speaker, and we're going to have it sent through the magics of technology. It's Dr. Arundolga Tulloch, and he's going to talk about the Centre for Commercialisation of Regenerative Medicine and similar initiatives from Canada. Go for it, Lockie.
Good morning. I'm sorry that I can't be with you live today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the discussion. I'm Arundolga Tulloch, and I'm the Head of Research and Development for Cytiva's Cell and Gene Therapy business. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cytiva, we were formerly GE Healthcare's life sciences business, and we're now a part of Danaher. We're a global tool and technology developer that specializes in end-to-end manufacturing for biotherapeutics. We've been in business for over 60 years, and we're probably best known as the #1 antibody purification company globally, where we support over 75% of the current monoclonal antibody therapies. We've expanded heavily through both internal technology development and acquisition into other innovative therapy space, and in particular cell and gene therapy, where we're proud today to be a part of 4 out of the 5 FDA-approved therapies on the market. I've been within the organization for about 17 years. I started my career as a bench scientist, and I've had the chance to progress through a number of technical project and leadership roles for the company. Of particular interest to this conversation is that I was fortunate enough to be a part of the founding team that put together a proposal for an industry, nonprofit government partnership in Canada between Cytiva, CCRM, and the Federal Development Agency of Ontario. The goal was to build a center of excellence around cell therapy manufacturing within Canada. And with its approval, I was lucky enough to help build the center and then direct it for its first 5 years of operation. As some background, CCRM is a public-private partnership. It was established in 2011, and it has a broad mandate to advance commercialization of regenerative medicine and cell therapies globally, but with a specific goal to try and build a local ecosystem that's going to position Canada at the forefront as a premier destination for the development and manufacturing space. In 2016, Cytiva partnered with CCRM and FedDev Ontario with an initial investment of $40 million to create a combined technology and process development services center. The process development activities were going to be focused on attracting small, medium, and large-sized biotechs and helping them to transition what were predominantly early stage academic therapies to commercial readiness from a manufacturing perspective. By doing this, the teams would also identify the challenges that were most limiting to those development steps, and then the technology teams could turn around and invent solutions which would ultimately be transferred to Cytiva for further development and commercialization. To date, the partnership has been a tremendous success for all of its members. CCRM has expanded its scope of activities to include investment in local startups, CGMP manufacturing for phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, and current activities to further expand that so that they can offer CGMP contract development and manufacturing services for therapies at all stages of development. In turn, Cytiva has been able to transition a number of new processes and new product concepts that are currently undergoing downstream development and ultimately will be commercialized. In terms of regional benefits, the community itself has directly benefited from $5 million of direct investment by CCRM and local startups, which in turn have turned that around and leveraged it to generate over $770 million of funding that's been received to date. The original center created 40, highly educated technology roles in the manufacturing and development space, which have now been multiplied to over 160 direct roles within CCRM and the Cytiva partnership alone. And if you add in the indirect roles, have generated several hundred local ecosystem jobs. Further, we've been successful in attracting over 20 international biotechs to the region for services, and we've been successful in helping several of those progress to clinical trials where they're now actively treating patients with curative therapies. As I take a step back and I look at the proposed charter for the BioManufacturing Alliance within Australia, I do see a number of similarities in approach. In particular, the vision to bring together academic, industry, and government resources and to create an ecosystem that's going to have everything that a therapy developer would need to go from ideation through early stage development, process development, and ultimately manufacturing and commercial production of that therapy within the local ecosystem. Further, as I look at Australia as a region, it does have a number of similarities to Canada in terms of its population and its economic size. So I think that the concept of a public-private partnership model can be successful in creating an ecosystem that can reach out and support not just local therapies, but more broadly the international community in the region and giving them a strong place to come and develop and mature those therapies for success without needing to try and go further afield in the global economic system. With this in mind, Cytiva is excited to be a prospective partner and has real hope that we can find a way to move this one forward. And we look forward to being a part of the continued discussions in the coming weeks. Again, I'm sorry that I can't be there live with you, and I thank you for the time to speak. Please feel free to reach out to me directly if any of my colleagues have questions that can't be addressed in the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. So there you go. It's possible. It's possible in Canada, and it's wonderful they're doing these incredible things there in Toronto. I might note I had been to Toronto once. I was stuck in an ice storm for 3 days on my way to Costa Rica. But to Janet, you also work for Cytiva and you're going to join our panel. And while people are thinking of some questions, we've had up to 120 people online on this call, so I'm sure somebody can dream up some questions. Maybe the rest of the panel can start opening their videos as well. I'm going to ask you a specific question, Janet, and we've got a couple of Q&A questions which I'll open up with, but this is the time to ask questions. If we don't get through all the questions, we'll try and answer them later offline. So Janet, you're the business development manager for Cytiva. Sort of, Aaron was talking about public-private partnerships. What do you think of the secret sauce? Is there 1 or 2 tips about public-private partnerships you'd give us or you talk about that make them really work well?
I think public-private partnerships work well where there's trust and mutual benefit and gain to be had on both sides. We really need the private sector to be invested and working closely with our the end users about our products, the patients. You had some very compelling anecdotes and case studies from individual patients, but it's the clinical data of patients from the real world being treated with QIMR and so forth that can really help inform how we can move forward with manufacturing large-scale cell therapies.
So there you go, trust. And we've gone in this panel session all the way from bench to bedside now to business.
And shared goals.
Shared goals.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the successes we've seen are very, very inspiring from the team we've heard from. We've had a couple of questions into the question, and I suppose there's sort of a bit of a slightly pointed question is, you know, this cell therapy manufacturing already exists in Victoria. You know, do we need it in Queensland as well? Why don't we just let Victorians do everything in the entire country, as long as they don't keep winning the stupid football? Does anybody want to try and respond to that about why here? Why not just? Which would be a disaster, and if I agreed to that, I'd be failing as a chief scientist. But I need some ammunition, guys.
I can probably give a manufacturing response, and it's purely about the scale of the need versus the scale of the facility. So for background, the facility in Melbourne and QGen are of similar scale and operations, though the facility in Melbourne is upgrading to respond to manufacturing a commercial product, and they're doing a fantastic job. But they focus on immune therapies alone, whereas there's a lot of cell therapies that aren't just immune therapies. And there is also a lot of innovation in Australia and a lot of innovation globally that needs to come to Australia, and it can't all be done in Melbourne. There's a critical global shortage, and that is especially acute in Asia and Australia. And we actually need a multiple response to create an ecosystem here to deal with what's required.
And maybe, Dan, you'd like to comment about the enormous advantages just in terms of people's lives being saved of having the research going on here and the clinical trials happening here, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, look, I would certainly support there being a manufacturing facility here. From my perspective as a clinician, you know, what I see, as you say, is the benefit for patients. But equally, that cycle of bench to bedside, bedside back to bench, and I think that really depends on having clinicians very close to the people who are manufacturing these products and developing them and taking them forward. And as you've seen, we have specific expertise here in Queensland that certainly doesn't exist in Victoria.
Yeah, so we can do things they can't do. And, you know, the life sciences research sector in Queensland has grown so rapidly. I mean, I think and QIMR has been at the head of that. Let's take advantage of all that genius and talent we've brought. Maybe somebody'd like to comment on the importance of attracting talent. I mean, we've just been through a pandemic. How much should we be investing in people? I would have thought that for a lot of researchers and a lot of companies, now is the time to be coming to Australia.
I can address that. I mean, we noticed that if you are actually don't have a skilled force to get engaged into the manufacturing side of things, it really just compromises you. You can have a great facility and great infrastructure, but if you don't have the right sort of skilled people to do that job, it just would be a major sort of a limiting factor. And you can see that a lot of big companies invested establishing big manufacturing capacities around the world, but then they were just lost the plot at the other end because they could not have the right people to run those facilities. Yeah.
So talent attraction, not just the infrastructure, the research, the clinical facilities and the doctors, but the broad scale manufacturing and research talent attraction is very important.
I think that skill development also happens not only within the industry, but also from the academic as well. You know, so imagine if there was a dedicated sort of some sort of short course in the university somewhere. I understand Monash University is actually currently in process of establishing a postgraduate sort of a training program for clean room manufacturing capabilities and other thing training. Right. So, you know, and we've had discussion with QUT, something on similar lines, I think previously, but I don't know whether it's ever been.
So it's not just the research talent, it's the manufacturing, it's the technical skills talents, which is we probably don't reward enough. Mathias.
I can probably add to that as well, Hugh. So very much what we see is occurring here, this is the creation of a new industry. And we are not talking hundreds of jobs, we are talking thousands of jobs in the not too distant future. So there needs to be a systematic development of the talent at all levels, at research levels, clinician levels, but also in the manufacturing at degree, postgraduate and non-degree levels. And it's actually a core part of the BioManufacturing Alliance proposal, is that you'll see who the partners are, you'll see we're coming together to create a facility and the capacity to be creating that workforce. So absolutely.
Mathias, then Dan.
I indeed want to reinforce the message that the BioManufacturing Alliance has together the skills and the intention to form such new skills in GMP manufacturing, focusing on cell and gene therapies. We've got our industry partner, we've got our academic partners, and as Leon said, collectively, we will grow these talents here because we can't just all attract them from overseas. We can attract some, but it's not enough. So we have to train them ourselves, and we will.
Excellent. Yes, over 57% of Australian engineers were trained overseas, and I just don't think that's a particularly sustainable way to run a manufacturing and global economy, a modern economy in Australia. So more training is essential. Hopefully the universities are listening to this. Dan.
Dan, you're muted.
Dan, did you have you're muted? Yeah.
Technical issues again, sorry about that. I just wanted to make the point, possibly self-evident, that you were at the start of a journey. You know, the products we're seeing now are really the start of advanced biologic manufacturing, and we have an opportunity to either commence what is already a lot of activity and commence a manufacturing process now, which will pay dividends for decades into the future, or not.
Great. Maybe changing topic a bit, and by all means just type away into the Q&A and chat if you've got answers to some of these questions. One of the other questions was about manufacturing of peptide therapeutics. I don't know if, Fabienne, you would like to talk about that topic at all, or is that something you want to throw to somebody else?
So about peptide and other products?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we have capacity in Australia in terms with the know-how, and all the other products, recombinant protein, peptides, other products. I mean, there's some huge scientific know-how for that also to develop. So I think it can often be complementary. You know, sometimes you have, especially around the manufacturing size, they're different products, but how can I say, the conditions for manufacture is, you know, have a lot of commonalities in them.
Right. So building a broad skill base in cell therapy is
skills
over.
You want a range of products. We have the capacity in Australia to develop a range of products, not limited to cell therapy. Cell therapy is a huge strength, no question, and certainly in the Sciences Queensland side. But we have capacity to develop monoclonal antibodies, peptide, recombinant proteins that can be used as therapeutic agents.
Mathias.
I would like to emphasize that growing our cell therapy manufacturing capability will actually have a knock-on effect on other capabilities, because as a result of that, we need warehousing, we need water for injection, we need buffer preparation, we need the very scarce fill and finish capabilities, especially for certain types of biologicals. It's very hard to find available capacity around the world. We will need to establish more capacity and capability in viral vectors, which are often an important product feeding into cell therapies. So all of that will have a knock-on effect on expanding other capabilities. And the BioManufacturing Alliance has been formed to grow all of these interlinked capabilities in sync.
Yep. We're coming to the end. We've got a minute or two left, but maybe I'll just throw to Janet to sort of wind us up. And the last question, I'm interested in how your company, Cytiva, I mean, how important is this broad issue of talent to you? I mean, I think infrastructure everybody gets, but do you see that variable across the region, and what do you think Australia could be doing most in the talent space, in the broadest sense of the word of talent?
Hugh, absolutely. Globally, there's a talent shortage, not just in the manufacturing operators, those that are involved in the quality control, making sure that the products that are manufactured and released, but also in the more senior roles, the commercialization aspects, those that are capable of running these companies to bring the products forward. And it's all part of the development and need for operators, not just to comply with GMP, but understanding that entire development pathway and the necessity to be really invested in developing a robust manufacturing process very early on, with taking products from early phase clinical trials right through to commercialization in really an unprecedented short time frame in these times. QIMR is a perfect example of that. So, yeah, and everybody has to be in there taking our talent with us.
Yes, and just emphasises also we need people like you. I mean, we need people who can develop businesses and can commercialise, innovators, and so it's a whole spectrum of talent we need across the board. And you know, that's something I think that the Queensland government is well aware of. We really need to build that broad-based talent to sustain these industries. Let me end by returning to thank Life Science Queensland for putting this all together, particularly Claire, Christine and Lockie. And Claire, I don't know if you have any parting words. We're right on 10:30. I've found this fascinating. I know nothing about the topic. I know now a lot more than nothing about the topic, and it's extremely exciting. So something that I can emphasise in my meetings with politicians. It's a great opportunity, and hopefully everybody in the community will stand together and support these great initiatives. Claire, any last words? I suspect
Claire
no.
may be on the...
Oh, that's Claire's demoted herself to a spectator. So thank you all, and thanks for this morning, and hope you have a great rest of the day in these sessions. See you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you for being succinct as well. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.